The handshake between Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia was more than a diplomatic gesture. It was the spark of a movement. Cameras captured the moment, analysts dissected it, and the world's power centers felt the tremor ripple through their foundations. For decades, the narrative had been shaped by Washington, Paris, and London. Africa and the Middle East were often placed in roles designed for them by others, suppliers of raw resources, battlegrounds for proxy wars, or markets for Western corporations. But on that day, as gold from West Africa met oil from Arabia, something entirely new was born, a partnership that defied permission, that rejected control, that spoke with its own voice. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not the typical leader the West had grown comfortable dealing with. Young, unpolished by elite European schools, untainted by the compromises of global institutions, he rose from the soil of Burkina Faso with a simple yet powerful conviction. Africa must reclaim its sovereignty. His military background gave him discipline, but his words carried something more potent: authenticity. Unlike career politicians who recited borrowed speeches, Traoré's voice echoed the frustrations and hopes of millions. He did not plead for aid. He demanded dignity. He did not bow to power. He confronted it. His speeches resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, young people shared his words on social media, calling him the embodiment of a new Pan-African spirit. He was not just a president in uniform. He was a symbol of resistance, a reminder that Africa's destiny would no longer be dictated from outside. On the other side stood Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a leader whose influence extended across the globe. For years, MBS had been reshaping Saudi Arabia with an iron hand and an ambitious vision. Vision 2030. He sought to reduce dependence on oil, modernize his nation, and position Saudi Arabia as a central player in global geopolitics. To his critics, he was controversial, but to his supporters, he was transformative. What made MBS crucial in this alliance was not merely his control over the world's most vital oil reserves, but his willingness to challenge Western dominance. He had already begun diversifying partnerships, investing heavily in China, Russia, and new markets across the global south. He no longer accepted the notion that Saudi Arabia was only relevant through its alignment with Washington. MBS wanted a seat at the table not as a guest, but as a host. When Traoré and MBS met, it was more than a courtesy visit. It was a recognition of shared struggles and shared ambitions. Africa's gold, long extracted by foreign corporations with little benefit to the continent, needed markets and fair terms. Arabia's oil, once seen as the lifeblood of Western economies, was now a tool to forge new alliances. Both leaders understood that their nations had been treated as resources, rather than partners. Both were determined to change that. Their handshake symbolized an agreement: no longer would Africa and the Middle East wait for Western approval to cooperate. They would trade directly, invest directly, and build directly. For the first time in decades, the flow of wealth and power would bypass traditional gatekeepers. In Washington, the mood was uneasy. Reports of the meeting landed on the desks of policymakers who had long assumed that both Africa and the Middle East would remain within the Western orbit. If Burkina Faso could secure partnerships outside of Western control, what would stop other African nations from following? If Saudi Arabia deepened its ties with non-Western states, what leverage would the West retain over global energy? Paris was equally rattled. For years, France had maintained influence in West Africa through language, military presence, and economic ties. But now, Traoré's rhetoric openly called for decolonization, not just politically, but economically and psychologically. His alliance with MBS was a direct challenge to France's grip. It was no longer just a question of resources, but of legitimacy. The Western media tried to downplay the handshake, framing it as symbolic, even irrelevant. But behind closed doors, think tanks and intelligence agencies warned, this was not symbolism. This was strategy. As weeks passed, the alliance began to take shape. Talks of gold for oil exchanges surfaced, bypassing the dollar system and challenging the petrodollar's dominance. Infrastructure projects were discussed: pipelines, refineries, railways linking West Africa to Arabian ports. Educational and cultural exchanges were proposed, aiming to strengthen ties beyond economics. For the Global South, this was a moment of inspiration. Leaders in Latin America, Asia, and Africa watched closely. If a small nation like Burkina Faso could align with a powerhouse like Saudi Arabia without bowing to Western oversight, what prevented others from doing the same? The rules of geopolitics, long written in Western capitals, were being rewritten by voices from the South. On the streets of Ouagadougou, young men and women waved flags, celebrating Traoré's defiance. Murals appeared on walls depicting Africa breaking chains, standing tall beside Middle Eastern allies. In Riyadh, newspapers highlighted the courage of a soldier who refused to be silenced, presenting Traoré as a brother in the struggle for independence and dignity. Social media exploded with hashtags, #GoldForOil, #AfricaRising, #South Alliance. Videos of the handshake went viral, sparking debates in universities, mosques, and cafes. For many, it was proof that the tides were shifting. The West scrambled to respond. Economic pressure was hinted at, with whispers of sanctions and diplomatic isolation. But unlike before, the threats felt weaker. Saudi Arabia was no longer solely reliant on the West. Burkina Faso, though smaller, was shielded by new alliances. The usual tools of coercion seemed blunt against leaders willing to endure hardship for sovereignty. Analysts warned that heavy-handed responses might backfire, accelerating the very shift the West feared. The more pressure applied, the stronger the Global South's resolve became. This was not the end of the story, but the beginning. The handshake between Traoré and MBS would be remembered not just as a meeting of two leaders, but as the moment when Africa and the Middle East declared their independence in unison. While empires whispered from boardrooms, the Global South began to speak from podiums, loud, clear, unapologetic. The rise of a new global order was not a prediction anymore. It was unfolding in real time.